Subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon to everybody. Today's hearing is intended to examine the issues surrounding U.S. exports to Africa, which are supposed to be at least balance African exports to the United States. This will include existing obstacles to two-way trade with Africa. The hearing will specifically examine the Increasing American Jobs Through Greater Exports to Africa Act of 2013, H.R. 1777. The bill was reintroduced this year, as we did previous years, by myself, Ranking Member Karen Bass, and my friend and colleague Bobby Rush, who was joining us on the panel, on April 26, and was introduced in the Senate on April 11th as S-718. The purpose of H.R. 1777 is to increase U.S. exports to Africa by 200% over the next decade. This bill does not replace AGOA. It complements it by providing for rebalancing that makes it as beneficial to Americans as it is to Africans. The bill intends to reach its ambitious but achievable goal by taking several steps, including the creation of a comprehensive U.S.-Africa trade strategy and a coordinator to ensure that all U.S. agencies involved in trade work in concert with one another. The legislation also calls for not less than 25% of available U.S. financing for trade deals to be devoted to facilitating U.S.-Africa trade. Furthermore, it encourages the descendants of Africa in this country, who largely operate small and medium-sized businesses, to play a greater role in trade with countries in Africa. Various studies show that every additional $1 billion in exports generates 6,000 to 7,000 new U.S. jobs. According to current data from the United States International Trade Administration, export-supported jobs linked to manufacturing account for an estimated 3.3% of my home state of New Jersey's total private sector employment. More than 1/6, or 17.2%, of all manufacturing workers in New Jersey depend on exports for their jobs. But U.S. exports have suffered during the global economic downturn because traditional markets, such as in Europe, are buying fewer U.S. products. According to the USITA, we are the largest importer of African goods, receiving 20% of the continent's total global exports. However, U.S. exports to Africa fell sharply during the height of the global recession. From 2008 to 2009, U.S. exports to Africa dropped 45%, from $78.3 billion to $42.8 billion. According to statistics released by the U.S. Census Bureau, African exports to the U.S. since AGOA took effect in 2001 increased from $25.4 billion to $66.9 billion in 2012, a huge increase of more than 262%. By far, petroleum exports from Africa led the way, with more than $28 billion in 2012 alone. Meanwhile, U.S. Census Bureau statistics showed that the United States exports to Africa increased from $12 billion to $32 billion from 2001 to 2012, an increase of 271%. Consequently, while U.S. exports to Africa showed a robust increase since the inception of AGOA, the U.S. trade deficit with Africa increased from $13 billion in 2001 to $34 billion last year. The 5 most popular import sectors for African countries are machinery and equipment, chemicals, petroleum products, including lubricating oils, plastics, and synthetic fibers, scientific instruments, and food products. That means that small and medium companies across the United States have commercial opportunities available in exporting goods and services to African countries. The African Development Bank estimates that 1 of 3 Africans is considered to be in the middle class. That's nearly 314 million Africans who have escaped poverty and now buy consumer goods, including those from the U.S. In the supermarkets and department stores that have sprung up across Africa in recent years, there are some American products already on the shelves, but there is space for more contributions from U.S. producers. Companies such as Procter & Gamble have long realized the potential of African markets. 2 years ago, Walmart, the world's largest retail outlet, purchased South Africa's Mass Mart and its 288 stores in 14 African countries. The Economist magazine created a significant buzz within the U.S.-Africa trade community 2 years ago when it announced that 6 of the world's 10 fastest-growing economies in the first decade of this century were in Africa: Angola, Chad, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Nigeria, and Rwanda. In the following 5 years, the economists projected that 7 of the 10 fastest-growing global economies would be in Africa: the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Ghana, Mozambique, Nigeria, Tanzania, and Zambia. Whether or not you agree with the popular slogan, Africa is rising, markets on the continent are attracting foreign trade and investment in increasing amounts. It is not only China that has had its sights set on African markets. Countries as diverse as India, Japan, Brazil, and Turkey all see the potential of selling their products in Africa. The Anglo-Dutch consumer goods giant, Unilever, has long considered Africa a lucrative environment for consumer sales, earning a fifth of its profits in Africa until the 1970s, when it turned its main commercial attention to Asia. Now Unilever is back in Africa in force, selling $3.7 billion of everything from soap to soup. Frank Bracken, head of Unilever's African operations, said African consumers are underserved and overcharged. To meet the continent's need for personal care products, Unilever developed its Motions range of products. At our hearing on this legislation last spring, we heard from Luster Products, which produces items that fits the description of what Unilever is selling as well. There is little reason why this company and other U.S. producers can't follow suit and meet the needs of Unilever says it is now meeting as an unmet need. We will hear today from 4 witnesses with expertise on the opportunities and challenges faced by U.S. companies in trade with countries in Africa. We expect to learn why the U.S. exports to Africa have not kept pace with U.S. imports from Africa, and find out why Congress can do better to balance U.S.-Africa trade. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Cicilline for any opening comments he might have.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and I also want to acknowledge and thank Ranking Member Bass for holding today's hearing on this very important issue, and extend my gratitude to the witnesses for their testimony today and for their important work on this very critical subject. As has been noted in The Economist, between 2001 and 2010, 6 of the world's 10 fastest-growing economies were located in Africa, and it is predicted that it will grow to 7 out of 10 by 2015. In light of this growth, it is critical that the United States remain a strong trading partner with nations on the African continent in order to remain competitive in today's global economy. We must cultivate new and existing trade relations with emerging markets in the African continent, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, to maintain and foster a strong, mutually beneficial relationship to harness this accelerated and exciting growth. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and recommendations on United States-African trade relationships and the future of this important partnership. And with the permission of the Chair, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Congressman Rush.
I want to thank my friend for yielding his time to me, and I want to join in the chorus of thanksgiving to the Chairman Smith, to Ranking Member Bass, and to all the members of the subcommittee for allowing me to participate in this hearing. And I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today to address this most important issue. Africa as a continent and its nations as trading partners offer U.S. businesses and government unprecedented and significant economic opportunities. I'm proud to work with my colleagues in a bipartisan and bicameral effort to remedy a problem that we see. As has been discussed many times, Africa is indeed a continent on the rise, and the African sub-Saharan region is definitely one of the fastest rising part of the African continent. More has been indicated. More than half of the world's 10 fastest growing economies are located in sub-Saharan Africa. What is even more impressive about that fact is that these economies are located where they are, in a region that, as we all know, is traditionally seen as underdeveloped. H.R. 1777 is indeed an important step in not only tapping into these vast markets, but also an important step in helping correct the trade imbalance that currently exists. In short, this is indeed a win-win, both for Africa and the U.S. I am disheartened by the continual projection of the image and the consciousness of Africa as only being in need of aid, when I think that the most prevailing solution to the problems of Africa, notwithstanding the aid, but is also to increase the level of trade. And during my tenure as a member of this Congress, I've had the opportunity to travel, as many of you have, and when I'm there, I'm impressed, but also disheartened about the amount of global investment that's happening in Africa, particularly Chinese investment. I'm glad because China and other nations are there, but I'm saddened because the U.S. is standing flat-footed as the other nations of the world are standing or are moving fleet-footedly. One of the distinctive resources that the U.S. has that places us at a trading advantage to other nations is our nation's vast diaspora, the ethnic and cultural linkages that have been forged with Africa throughout our own history, links inextricably to the continent. Indeed, our economic prosperity was founded, is dependent upon, and has grown thanks to Africa's vast resources and to Africa's people. Through this bill, we will be able to leverage trade opportunities with Africa. It is an economic prescription that will promote our economic aims and our objectives and give the U.S. a leg up over our competitors. And once again, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this hearing, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for allowing me to participate. And I look forward to hearing the testimony of these expert witnesses, and I will look forward to also asking a few questions of my own. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rush, and you're welcome anytime to join us. So thank you for being here and for your leadership on the bill. Deeply, deeply appreciated. We do have, and I say this to our distinguished witnesses, a few votes on the floor right now. So we will temporarily take a recess and then come back. And again, I want to apologize, and we'll lead off with Ms. Bass's opening statement and then go to our witnesses. Thank you for your patience. Aren't you forgetting something? Subcommittee will resume its hearing, and the chair recognizes Ms. Bass, the ranking member.
Okay, as always, I want to extend my appreciation to Chairman Smith for his leadership in this, on this issue and for calling this hearing. And also to my colleague who has left us, Mr. Rush. I want to compliment both of them for moving swiftly to reintroduce H.R. 1777, Increasing American Jobs Through Greater Exports to Africa Act, and holding a hearing on a topic that is a key priority for me personally and for the more than 1 billion people living and doing business on the continent. Let me also acknowledge Senator Durbin for leading the way in the Senate regarding the bill's reintroduction, and also the bill's other co-sponsors, Senator Coons and Landrieu and Bozeman. It has been a pleasure to work with them. I think this bill is an example of our bipartisan and bicameral commitment to the continent, and I always tell everybody, we only make the news when we're fighting. When we're working on something together that is going along smoothly, that, for whatever reason, is not newsworthy. I believe that if we focus on the task at hand, strengthening economic opportunities for the U.S. and nations of Africa, we will benefit from the continent on the rise. In Washington, we often hear about Africa's rise and its reemergence. 6 of the world's fastest growing economies over the last decade are located in Africa, and that number is expected to increase to 7 by 2015. Yet this information more often remains a well-kept secret to U.S. businesses looking for new profitable markets. I also think that it's very positive that the legislation calls for the appointment of a special White House coordinator who would focus on an assertive, whole-of-government approach promoting U.S. private sector engagement with the continent. As the U.S. economy strengthens, we need to seize the moment and recognize that the expanding markets in Africa and the growing middle class who increasingly attend universities in the U.S. present opportunities for engagement by our government and by the U.S. private sector. These are opportunities that our competitors in China, India, the EU, and Brazil have been quick to exploit. These are opportunities that can and will prove transformative for our economy and the billion Africans eager to be full participants in a global marketplace. Africa is no longer interested in development aid alone. Africa, with a U.S. educated middle class, want to do business increasingly with the United States. We must recognize that Africa itself is in transition and seeks partners that want to provide opportunities for trade, economic growth, and investment. It is time for our government and the private sector to see Africa through a new prism. Mr. Chairman, nearly a year ago, President Obama released the U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa. In this policy directive, there are 4 interlocking pillars: strengthening democratic institutions, spurring economic growth, trade and investment, advancing peace and security, and promoting opportunity and development. While this hearing may focus on the second pillar of economic growth and trade, our success in accessing African markets will rely on the strength of each of these pillars and their ability to develop and sustain environments that will support the type and quality of business engagement that will attract and retain American businesses. U.S. companies such as General Electric, Microsoft, and Firestone, as well as our witnesses today, understand the importance of stability, good governance, and the institutions that encourage and welcome businesses that create jobs and help put an end to poverty of individuals and communities across the continent. A couple of weeks ago in Los Angeles, where I represent, I invited representatives from MCC, the XM, OPEC, and the Department of Commerce to my district in Los Angeles to help educate and raise awareness on how California-based businesses can access U.S. government resources intended to seek opportunities throughout Africa, and to do so safely and with a sense of security that their investments will be safeguarded. And I'm not the only one. I understand that Senator Coons has held forums in his home state of Delaware on doing business in Africa. And last year, Representative Ellison invited me to his district where we met with the Somalian diaspora. And there are other members like Chairman Royce, Rush, Isaacson, Rangel, and McDermott, all of whom care deeply about strengthening our economic ties with the continent. To this point, I commend the President for launching the Doing Business in Africa last year through the Department of Commerce and holding the Doing Business in Africa Forum earlier this year. This forum and the program aims to leverage the federal government's trade, promotion, financing, and strategic communications capacities to help U.S. businesses identify and seize opportunities in Africa. Mr. Chairman, in closing, I want to acknowledge the bipartisan and bicameral support for AGOA, our lead trade agreement with Africa. The Foreign Affairs Committee has a long history of supporting this legislation, including Chairman Royce, who has been a staunch and ardent supporter. Representatives Rangel, McDermott, and also the chairman have been long champions. I look forward to working with you and our fellow colleagues as we continue to elevate U.S.-Africa policy, as well as look for any and all opportunities to strengthen our own economy while also benefiting African nations. Thank you, and I look forward to your testimony.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Bass. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Moreno. Okay. Let me now introduce our distinguished panelists, beginning first. Over his 50-year career at the State Department, talk about a journeyman, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and in private sector work, Mr. Stephen Landy has worked extensively to expand U.S. trade. He has worked as a Foreign Service Officer, a senior trade negotiator, and an assistant U.S. Trade Representative. He has negotiated trade agreements with countries around the world, and he was instrumental in the creation of the Generalized System of Preferences, or GSP, the Caribbean Basin Initiative, and NAFTA. Mr. Landy continues to work with African governments and teaches international trade at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Without objection, we will put the full bios, which for all of you, which are very extensive, as a part of the record. We'll then hear from Mr. Peter Hansen, who is an attorney with 15 years of legal experience, who specializes in public international law and African investment law. He has served with the United Nations and World Bank and has taught, lectured, and published on the United States and international law topics. Mr. Hansen advises clients on African investment and the development of commercial projects involving Africa. He has taught, lectured, and published on international legal subjects. We'll then hear from Dr. Sharon Freeman, who's the president and CEO of the All-American Small Business Exporters Association. She is an entrepreneur and has undertaken major development assignments in over 100 countries around the world. Dr. Freeman has been appointed to numerous U.S. government boards, including those of the Department of Commerce, the Ex-Im Bank, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, the SBA, and the Department of Energy. She has also won awards from leading business institutions and government agencies in recognition of her business and community leadership and business successes. We will then hear from Ms. Barbara Keating, who is the president and founder of Computer Frontiers and has 25 years of experience working in Africa, bringing technology solutions to the most remote parts of the continent. She has worked for several companies and partnered with USAID in support of various U.S. government initiatives and has Peace Corps experience as well. She works to provide effective communication services in limited infrastructure environments and adapting technology to improve performance for government agencies, NGO programs, and private companies. Mr. Landy, if you would begin.
Please put your microphone.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak before you on a very current topic. When you've been in trade policy and investment policy as long as I do, I always begin by saying this is not the History Channel, but hopefully we're looking forward to other policies that we may be able to discuss. We have all read the tea leaves about Africa and can almost smell the opportunities that will ooze from collaborating with a continent of over 1 billion, increasingly urbanized, more dynamic, better educated, deeper democracy, upwardly mobile, and mostly young. Unfortunately, our private sector has not heard this message. As pointed out, some of the larger companies are involved, and you mentioned the names earlier, and we appreciate that. We believe that it is a possibility for the U.S. Congress working together with the U.S. administration to demonstrate that there is full support for U.S. investment. We're not a communist society. We don't have state-operated, state-owned enterprises. We don't tell people where to invest. But what we can do as a group, we can work to make sure that there's a level playing field that exists for U.S. investors, U.S. exporters overseas. To do this, Manchester Trade has come up with their own idea, which we call a new transatlantic South partnership. As you know, the U.S. is focusing on a trans-Pacific partnership involving 12 Asian and Latin American countries. We are working on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, which focuses on 27 European countries. However, unlike the other two, which focuses on trade agreements, our suggestion for a transatlantic South partnership goes well beyond trade agreements and will encompass investment and development goals. It will realize there was significant U.S. national security consideration and will herald the whole of government approach that was mentioned by Ranking Member Bass just before in her comments and so on. However, what we are talking about, an important component, is coordination in Congress. And that's the message that I would like to spend a few minutes and focus on. Just for example, we all know that Ways and Means Committee is going to soon consider, hopefully renew, and even more importantly, enhance the current African Growth and Opportunity Act. We all know that H.R. 177, which we are very pleased that Chairman Smith has reintroduced and so on again this year, and with bipartisan support, and so on, focuses on exports. We all know that last year, Congressman Bobby Rush introduced H.R. 656, the African Investment and Diaspora Act. Between them, they form a perfect triangle for moving into Africa as a group. They must proceed under congressional rules, under their own committees and so on. That's how it operates. But if there could be coordination, and in this regard, we must recognize the efforts of Ranking Member Bass to bring together a group of influential members, all with the commitment of Africa. This is the kind of thing that must happen for us to be successful with a coordinated approach. I guarantee you the Chinese coordinate everything that they do there, and so on. And they have the advantage of being able to tell their SOEs and their provinces where to invest. We don't have that, but we could certainly coordinate to assure a level playing field. Let me just use the few minutes that I have been given to just touch a few measures which could help illustrate where this kind of coordination could take place. I want to be clear, there's a lot of ideas out there. The Corporate Council has just come up with 44 suggestions in the trade investment area. The Wilson Center has turned out a very good paper to which we were very pleased to participate in. But so we're putting out these ideas not as exclusive, but as ideas for further work and so on. We've already mentioned the fact that Ways and Means Committee should focus on imports, and the Act to double U.S. exports from this committee can work together very nicely and so on. Export-Import Bank is the largest source of funding for U.S. business overseas. The bank itself has been committed to increase resources. In fact, under the leadership of Chairman Hochberg, under Chairman Hochberg and so on, Rick Aggioni, who runs the African Bureau and so on. We have seen since the beginning of the Obama administration an increase of export-import financing for Africa from $400 million to $1.5 billion last year, almost a 4 times increase, which is impressive. Your bill, even better, your bill calls for 10% of Export-Import Bank financing to go to Africa, or else you should report to Congress why not, which is a good way to push for going there. Well, that will result, if you assume that our financing will be the neighborhood of $40 billion next year, $4 billion. So that's another doubling. So we support that. But we have to go a little bit deeper than that, and that's where you have to work with the Financial Services Committee. Because Export-Import Bank is very proud of the fact that people pays back the money that it lends to them. And obviously, we don't want to have some recent examples where people didn't pay back money. We know what happens in that case. But on the other hand, if you're going to work in a frontier economy, like an African economy, you have no choice but to take greater risk. So I don't know how you're going to work out the 2%, we shouldn't lose money, yet you have to take greater risk. One idea we have, which involves some work, is that maybe there could be more coordination with MCC, with U.S. aid, and maybe they could help service the debt, so service a loan. So if Export-Import Bank gives a loan and it's entitled to a higher interest rate, maybe they can contribute some money that they can use in order to do this. There's many ideas. Another idea we've been working on, a little bit separate than this, but it makes sense, is given the need for fiscal probity, Export-Import Bank, OPIC, TDA, all require all kinds of paperwork. It has to be done. Well, a little guy can't do it. A middle SME can't do it. A diaspora company can't do it. Maybe it could well be possible that MDBA, SBA can work together with Export-Import Bank, with the other lending institutions, and try to conglomerate investments and put them together and provide the technical assistance. In other words, we must work together. Regional integration. There is nothing more important to U.S. commercial and political interest than integrated Africa. We cannot live in the post-colonial area. We're a relatively small continent compared to others. We're sliced into 47, now 48 countries of sub-Saharan Africa. They must come together. And this is in your bill. You promote it. But again, it has to be done with ways and means because it's a trade issue. So they involve both together and so on. But let me mention what I consider the biggest threat we face. AGOA is a good program. It should be renewed. I don't know, excuse me, I don't know how much time I have, but it still says 5, and I know you're not supposed to go over 5, so I'll just keep talking.
If you could just sum up, because it is.
Yeah, let me go.
Input on that.
Let me make my 3 points and end. I didn't want to cut myself off either, but I didn't want to go on. Okay, but let me make 3 very quick points and make them very specific and so on. Regional integration, extremely important for the U.S. It provides sufficient scope for U.S. multinationals, large U.S. companies to reach the economy of scales, working together with the UN and peacekeeping, and so on, regional community peer group pressure is extremely important, and so on. The U.S. provides AGOA, which basically says non-reciprocal, when you're together as a group, let's negotiate a group. The Europeans have come up with economic partnership agreement, horrible things from a trade point of view. If you don't sign, we cut off access. The U.S., free access. The U.S. is right. Africa isn't ready to sign until they're a group. What we are suggesting is that together with the relevant committees, we send a signal to the Europeans, excuse me, we're doing a transatlantic partnership with you. Let's make sure that extends to Africa, to our southern area, and so on. The other quick recommendation there, of course, is that they have a, you work with the European Parliament. European Parliament was just pressured into agreeing to this deadline. It would be good if together with yourselves you could have a consultation, whether a regular schedule or special, to look at this issue and so on. President Obama, when he took office, was very specific. He said, we cannot do things alone. We have to work with other countries. We have too many unilateral sanctions, conditions. Every committee has something else, and each of the objectives are good. But if you're a U.S. businessman and you suddenly face a condition on whether you use, carbon emission, even though Africa is unfortunately going to have to use fossil fuels. If you have a condition that you can't use U.S. agricultural, you can't promote U.S. agriculture, which promotes things, that you may have an AGOA benefit, but it could be taken away if it turns out that the country is undemocratic. We're arguing very basically that there should be some committee within the Congress which would review these conditions and look at them 2 things. 1, are they effective in the way they operate? The worst thing we have done is take Madagascar off of AGOA because we didn't like a bunch of colonel thugs for seizing power. 7 years later, those thugs are around, and 200,000 Madagascan women who are trying to help could have lost their job. So we want this kind of review. A third quick focus is on agriculture. Again, beyond Feed the Future, we would want to look at 1, let's give Africa a chance to export the products it can export. It produces tobacco, it produces sugar, it produces peanuts or groundnuts, it sweetens cocoa. All that is not included because of domestic interest, even though if you let Africa ship them, they would have no effect on domestic industry. They would be able to compete against Brazil and displease them if we could give some attention to that. So in conclusion, what we are really arguing for is there's a whole area which involves more than one committee that has to be looked upon. The contribution of Congress can be to work together. The tea leaves are in place. For some reason, Mr. Foreman, the only NSC advisor who ever went to Africa, but then he spent 2 weeks there. and as I said, only went there on an economic mission. He spent 2 weeks there, going to 5, 6 countries and so on, is now the USTR. Also remaining as a special advisor to the president if Congress approves him and so on, et cetera. You have all these ideas coming from the private sector. Every time you read something, you talk about Africa is on the way. Every magazine article, you cited The Economist, Forbes, all there. I really would hope very much that this Congress could focus on a transatlantic South partnership with Africa. Thank you so very much.
Glenn, thank you so very much. Mr. Hansen.
Thank you very much. I've been told I'm a firebrand, so I hope I don't disappoint without alienating anyone. I would just like to start by saying I think the bill is an excellent step in the right direction. In my written testimony, which is fairly extensive, I made some minor suggestion as to wording to emphasize investment. And I'd like to request at this time that my written testimony be put in the record.
Without objection, your full statement will be made a part of the record and that of all of our distinguished witnesses.
Thank you. I'd like to start off with a few relevant figures that could put matters into context. Unfortunately, they're surprising, perhaps humorous, and all the more horrifying for being so. First off, sub-Saharan Africa's entire GDP of $869 billion is 79% of the U.S. budget deficit in 2012. So it's less than our budget deficit. In other words, close to 900 million people in the region of sub-Saharan Africa, that's almost 3 times the U.S. population, live on a little under 6% of our GDP. So when we ask Africans to buy more U.S. products, it's like asking Americans to buy more U.S. products after losing 98% of their income. As for trade, U.S. apparel imports, about which there has been a great deal of talk and legislation over the years, apparel imports under AGOA now roughly equal Americans' consumption of over-the-counter teeth whiteners, which is sad. U.S. food imports from rural agricultural Africa, filled with farmers, in 2011 were about half of what America spent on Twinkies, and even less than what Americans spent on Halloween costumes for their pets. As for investment, which is critical, U.S. investment in Africa, after decades of amassing assets there and operations there, is a little bit more than what Americans waste on gambling in a year, and little more than twice what Americans spend on Easter. This is quite sad. Which brings me to one of my 2 points, which is the U.S. is losing Africa because it will not invest in Africa. It is a cold fact that U.S. investment must precede U.S. exports, as my written testimony made clear with examples of Taiwan and the People's Republic of China. As things stand, the U.S. has almost no economic relationship with sub-Saharan Africa beyond oil. If the U.S. were to level sanctions against sub-Saharan Africa in every non-oil sector, it could hardly be more effective than present U.S. indifference. The U.S. wants to sell to Africa, but has not wanted to date to buy or to invest there. The U.S. government has done almost nothing to secure treaty protections for U.S. investors in sub-Saharan Africa. And by that I mean bilateral investment treaties, or BITs, or double tax treaties, which are known also as DTTs or DTAs. By contrast, the People's Republic of China wants to sell, wants to buy, and wants to invest in sub-Saharan Africa. This is why China is ascendant in Africa. Finally, as the stats in the rise of China show, AGOA is an economic irrelevance and a strategic distraction of disastrous proportions. This is not to say, incidentally, that AGOA should be set aside, but it is a major distraction. So this brings me to my last point, which is that the U.S. must get serious about investing in Africa if it wants to export to Africa and influence Africa, indeed to retain any kind of strategic position on the continent. The U.S. has got to quit arguing about AGOA and see it as but a small part of a far larger Africa strategy. The U.S. has to treat African countries like other countries, especially as we do the People's Republic of China, We have to accord African countries what I would call most favored investment partner status, or to adapt a more current trade law term, to have, quote, normal investment relations, end quote, as with other countries. African countries should not uniquely have to earn U.S. economic partnership by jumping through hoops and meeting passing ever-moving goalposts. The U.S. government should seek to turn Africa and African countries into economic partners. In earlier writings referenced in my written testimony, I have called this the mature market model, or M3. The U.S. has to quit worrying about closed economic sectors, whether it's mining or hotels. The U.S. has closed economic sectors as well. What the U.S. government has to do is engage with Africa and allow U.S. investors to penetrate those markets and gradually to crack open those closed sectors by gaining trust on the continent. The U.S. government has got to conclude BITs and DTTs, that's bilateral investment treaties and double tax treaties, across the continent. Arab North Africa, along the Mediterranean Rim, has 60% coverage of both BITs and DTTs. Once you get down to Black Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, BIT coverage drops to a mere 11%, and double tax treaty coverage to 2%. In other words, one double tax treaty with South Africa. This is ridiculous. We need to conclude those treaties forthwith. Also, if a stunning gesture is looked for, a sensible approach would be to have a multilateral, continent-wide, multilateral investment treaty and multilateral double tax treaty. And very finally, U.S. aid should reform whole industries and embrace private projects as well. This is, in my writings, called the aid and investment model, or AIM approach, rather than ineffective, one-off, isolated, and useless projects and studies. Thank you.
Mr. Hansen, thank you very much for your testimony. I think this is the first testimony I've seen where there were 85 footnotes, so I do appreciate the extensiveness of your research. Dr. Freeman.
Thank you very much. Chairman Smith, ranking member, and members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today in my capacity as the president of the All-American Small Business Exporters Association about increasing American jobs through greater exports to Africa. I've read extensively the bill, and I applaud it and certainly support it. First, I'd like to briefly mention why it's important to encourage exporting to Africa by SMEs, including the African diaspora firms. The U.S. International Trade Commission's 2010 report called Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises, Characteristics and Performance confirmed that SMEs play a larger role in the export economy than is often suggested by traditional trade statistics. In fact, it's estimated that SMEs support 4 million jobs through their exports. While we know a lot about the role of SMEs in exporting, we know less about the contribution and potential of a subset of SMEs, which is minority and immigrant-owned firms, particularly African immigrant-owned firms. So here's what we know. We do know that according to the 2007 census, minority-owned exporting firms were larger than their non-exporting minority-owned counterparts. We also know that minority-owned exporting firms average having about 21 employees, while non-exporting minority-owned firms have about 7. Their receipts, that is, the exporting minority firms, are greater per employee, and significantly so than non-exporting firms. We know further that minority business export activity spans into at least 41 countries over 6 continents. And we know that minority firms are primed for exporting, due in large part to their language capabilities, their cultural compatibility, and business agility. Now, let's consider what we know about Africans in the U.S. This is important. We know that they have home country linkages. We also know that most of these immigrants are located in high-density exporting areas, such as California and New York and so forth. We also know that the largest African sending countries, such as Nigeria and Ethiopia among them, are also among the countries to which we export in growing number. Surely that's not a coincidence. Given this, what we need to do and consider is what could be done to consider encouraging firms with home country linkages, in other words, African-owned firms, to export more to their home countries. So there are about 6 suggestions I have in the time that I've been allotted. Otherwise, I'd have a lot more. But the first thing we have to do really is understand that it is necessary to compete with China. And in that recognition, we have to know that it's not possible to have a one-size-fits-all strategy in how we go about that competition. We can say for certain that China does not pursue a one-size-fits-all strategy. They have a very tailored commercial strategy for each and every country, which they negotiate directly with the presidents of those countries. And I must say, the total number of African presidents that's ever been in America at one time is 6, whereas certainly the head of China has all of the African countries visit them at one time. So the reality is China is a competitor no matter where we're trying to export in Africa, and so we have to have a China strategy. Now, I know that your bill mentions the Trade Promotion Coordinating Committee a number of times. I know it very well, and I've known it for many, many years. I've read all of the national export strategies. I've worked closely with this coordinating body, but here's the thing I want to say about the coordination. It's not just a matter of coordinating the unified budgets of the 19 or 20 federal government agencies. We have to be more strategic about what we're actually coordinating. And what I want to say in particular to draw your attention to is one example of the failure of strategic coordination is, for instance, the fact that the U.S. Agency for International Development has come up with new rules wherein they say for all the countries in which they're operating that now we can, U.S. companies working there can procure all of the goods from those local countries, no matter where those goods come from. So if you look on the shelves of Malawi, you name a country, where do those goods come from? They don't come from, they're not made in Malawi. So we have now just eliminated just huge billions of dollars worth of export opportunities for our small firms. That's not proper coordination. On the one hand, we have the National Export Initiative, and on the other, we are removing the export opportunities for our firms. Another issue that I want to mention is export processing zones. Long time ago, USAID used to actually help fund those. I worked on them, so I know this is a total fact. They haven't done this for years, but I tell you who's doing it now, that's China, big time, because they know that their firms need a foothold in that country. And so when it becomes difficult for Chinese firms to work in African firms, they create a zone that makes it easier. When they have power, when they have exemption from laws and regulations, they can do their business. And they're doing that business not just to export from the zone into a foreign territory. The foreign territory becomes the domestic territory. That means they're exporting into Africa from that zone. That's a very important concept, and we need to get with that concept. So what I'm saying is for all of the things that USAID is doing, one of the things they need to be doing is having another look at this. And I tell you who's looking at this finally again is the World Bank and the IFC. For many years, they considered this an economic distortion. But what they've come to realize is that it's an economic and competitive reality. And now they are sponsoring it too. I'm going to say 3 other things really quickly. One is mentor-protege programs, and this is to help small firms actually link with larger firms to take advantage of some of the procurements that are involved in the Millennium Challenge Corporation and other of the TPCC institutions, so that this helps the protege firms to develop the capacity to export more. And of course, we do know that if you sell anything right here in Washington, D.C. to the World Bank or any of the international organization, that is an export because they're a foreign entity. So we have a U.S. Executive office in the World Bank. Here's an idea. Why don't we get a list of, those procurements and see how many U.S. companies are involved? And then why don't we give incentives to some of those companies that got some of those procurements to join together with smaller firms? I think that's very important. Awareness campaigns. I think it's important for the U.S. Trade Representative's Office and some of the other TPC offices to specifically figure out where are these African diaspora firms located, because we know that essentially from the Migration Policy Institute's data hub, you can find it in 5 minutes by zip code, and then let's reach out to them because we can see a pattern of a relationship between increasing exports to their countries where they're located. So when you see more Ethiopians in Prince George's County, you see more exports from Prince George's County to Ethiopia. So let's match up and connect these dots. Finally, in regard to export financing, what I liked about your bill in particular is that there's a recognition that you need administrative funds to do the outreach. It's not just program funds. So I do note that and support that, and I support the comments of my colleagues, and I thank you for the honor of being here today.
Dr. Freeman, thank you as well for your testimony and your very specific recommendations based on extraordinary experience. Thank you. Ms. Keating.
Chairman Smith and the members of the subcommittee, and especially to Congresswoman Bass, and your staff for your very active role in bringing new voices like mine to you to hear about the issues. My name is Barbara Keating. I'm the president and CEO of Computer Frontiers. We're a small woman-owned business. I've been in business since 1996. I started it in a spare bedroom in Germantown, Maryland. And since that time, we've been focused on Africa. We work in 34 African countries. We're incorporated in 9 countries. And we currently have 4 fully staffed offices on the African continent, as well as my office in Frederick, Maryland. I'm speaking to you today as a representative of small business who has worked to establish business throughout Africa and the continuing and growing challenges that are arising for companies like mine. There are 2 major points that I want to bring to your attention in regards to increasing U.S. exports to Africa, and those are to support that 1, small and medium-sized businesses is the right place for you to focus your support, and 2, now is the time to act. Why focus on small and medium-sized business? One reason is that there are 54 African countries, and the majority of these countries have relatively small individual markets, making these markets less attractive to larger U.S. corporations. However, for small and medium-sized businesses, African markets are the right size, leading to cooperative partnerships and long-term relationships for continuing growth between the U.S. and African businesses. My oldest company is located in Uganda. It is 13 years old. Initially, with a partner, we grew the company together from 5 to 35 core, highly qualified technical staff and hundreds of consultants and trainees throughout the last decade. In Uganda, as well as in Togo, my companies with my partners grew and expanded in both staff and revenue. From these bases, we then expanded our reach into other surrounding African country markets, incorporating in 5 other countries and hiring staff and providing services without having full-fledged offices there. The bottom line is that 90% of my professional staff based here in the United States are reliant on our work in Africa. And yet we are a small company. The challenges are many for small U.S. companies not only to enter and succeed in Africa, but then once established, to move from the startup phase to the scale is further challenged by the lack of coordinated U.S. government focus on Africa, as well as from U.S. policies seemingly almost unwittingly bent on crushing small business. I'll discuss each of these in turn. First, one could find that the U.S. government is providing many resources, including financing, for U.S. small business to increase their exports to Africa. However, where to go and what is really available is a hit or miss affair based on the knowledge of the staff and the government agencies you meet, and this amorphous resource pool does not, in reality, seem to be more than a few inches deep. And in my experience over the last decade, the bureaucratic hoops that must be passed through to even determine if your business qualifies for a program or financing are almost in themselves too unlikely to succeed, too time-consuming, and we in our own analyses have deemed them unrealistic to even raise the effort to apply. Other than minimal bank lines of credit based on receivables, we have had no loans or financing. It is almost impossible to grow, and we continue to cycle at the same level of activity. What would help is a more coordinated focus on Africa to include a strategic trade policy and a one-stop shop for small business to more quickly determine if there are any supported options for our programs. Second, in this same vein of challenges, is access to Africa. One of the main pluses to being a U.S. State Department, USAID, or other U.S. government agency contractor in Africa is that contract vehicle for small businesses like ours gives us a reason to be in that market. Currently, as Ms. Freeman also testified, the USAID Forward implementation and procurement reform process is requiring more local contracting and loosening the hold on the Buy America Act. While one might think that that would be an excellent move for a small business like mine, who has established local presence for more than a decade in Africa, the rule has language, I hope which is unintended, which rules out companies like mine. The new rule requires that to be considered a local company, it must be owned at 51% levels by the local nationals from that country, eliminating U.S. majority-owned companies like mine, which have long vested in these markets. To my mind, the reason for a U.S. person or entity to maintain 51% controlling interest is to ensure that we comply with U.S. and local laws. And it appears, in my humble opinion, to be an advantage for the U.S. government. However, this is not what is being implemented. Further, as part of the USAID Forward procurement reform, large contracts, which large USAID government contractors will pursue in Africa for USAID, will be required to include 30% of the contract value to go to African local companies. Previously, these subcontracts may have gone to small U.S. companies like mine. However, it is now unlikely that U.S. small businesses will be considered to partner and provide services for these large contracts, as we don't meet the checkbox requirements for being a local company. In summary, USAID Forward takes away both a logical vehicle for U.S. small business that has now used this to access and grow in African markets, and further takes away our competitiveness in U.S. contract marketplace itself. Now is the time to act. Over the last 10 years, I have been part of the discussion in Washington with relevant department heads, congressional members on the Chinese entry into African markets, and have posited the notion that U.S. companies have no support from the U.S. government in Africa, while we are exposed in direct competition with Chinese businesses having full power and financing of the Chinese government behind them. A common response has been that it's just sour grapes the U.S. private sector is experiencing from the new competition in the African markets. However, today we can clearly see how China's government's efforts over the last decade has positioned its companies to be the largest African investors by far. We should not dwell only on the Chinese investment or their good sense in pursuing the African market, as other countries are also providing significant support to their companies to aggressively expand into Africa. I have myself seen it from Europe, India, Turkey, the Gulf states, Brazil, Malaysia, Israel, and South Africa. It is resulting in the reality that the U.S. investment share is shrinking simply because others are doing more. As is stated in the U.S. Corporate Council on Africa in their policy recommendations to the Obama administration this year, and where I have been a board member and a member during the last over the last 10 years, some European companies are pursuing commercial advantage through economic partnership agreements and reviving traditional relationships. Some countries are offering concessional financing in addition to innovative combinations of government assistance and private sector contracting that the U.S. government has been increasingly unable to match. The move to create a BRICS infrastructure bank is an indicator of how emerging powers are shifting focus towards Africa. If the U.S. does not work to reverse this trend, long-term opportunities for U.S. business will be greatly limited. A substantial additional commitment of human, financial, and policy resources is needed to support our national interests in Africa. At a bare minimum, the United States should be matching the support provided by other governments to their private sector. Thank you for your attention to this.
Thank you very much for your testimony and for being here to share your insights and wisdom. Just a few opening questions, and I'll yield to my distinguished colleagues. And again, your full statements really are helpful to this subcommittee because you have taken the time to give us a very broad look. Obviously, time didn't permit each of you to say everything in your paper, but I can assure you, I read it, and I know members of the subcommittee will do likewise. So thank you so much for that. Let me just ask Dr. Friedman, you mentioned that all firms entering Africa, the African market, now have to compete with China. And I'm wondering if, you know, there's a number of issues, and all of you might want to speak to this, but I have been baffled, frankly. I've been here 33 years. We know that much of the content of what we deal with in terms of our policy, first it was the Soviet and the proxies there between ourselves and the USSR, but now it's been, you know, the focus on PEPFAR, the malaria, TB, the wars in Sudan, obviously the problems in DR Congo. I mean, we've been crisis managers, if you will, how well or poorly is up to the judgment of history, but there has been a genuine compassion and concern on both sides of the aisle through various presidencies to try to help out and to be a real force for good. But I wonder sometimes if the branding of Africa in the mind's eye of the Americans becomes one of crisis after crisis after crisis, inhibiting and chilling investment. And Mr. Hansen, you talked about the need for investment. So I'm wondering how we change that perception. It would seem to me that an exporting strategy, which is why we're doing this bill or trying to promote it and get it passed, will finally say it's in America's interest, but it's also the more robust the give and take between the African countries and the U.S. Are, the better, you know, the rising tide will lift all those boats. But this idea of the branding, you know, I've been to Africa many times. It is a wonderful place to visit. Even when we go to difficult places, they're usually like difficult places here or any other country in the world. You know, there's also a number of oases everywhere you go where people are living their lives, their children are growing, and, you know, opportunities, if they could get more, would mean that they have a greater quality of life. So I'm wondering if you could speak to the branding issue. Why hasn't, Mr. Hansen, the investment actually occurred? Is it because of that? Is it not easy to get financing on the stock markets, you know, or ETFs not, you know, sufficiently including, you know, Africa businesses? If you could start off with that, I'd appreciate it. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith. It's a complex question. I think as to the branding issue, I've written that if Asia gets CNBC, Africa is relegated to the late-night murder segments of the local news, I'm afraid. I think journalists love to go out there with their flak jackets and go in for Pulitzers, and they don't want to report on Ghana's explosive growth. They don't want to report on the quiet places of Africa, the vast, vast tracts of Africa that are quiet and ready to prosper. They want Somalia, and they don't even talk, when they talk about Mogadishu, it's Black Hawk Down type stuff. It's not that the Turks are coming in and investing at a tremendous clip. So I think what Africa simply needs is normality from the U.S. perspective. I think the U.S. needs to treat Africa as it would treat Asia, as it would treat Mexico, as it would treat Latin America. It should no longer be a plaything of the United States, and particularly the United States government and the United States aid industry. It simply needs to have protections put in for business and a tone, however the U.S. government wants to promote that, that would be great, but a tone that it's simply open for business and ready to work. I think that's everything. And I believe Ms. Freeman has some other insights.
Well, actually, my comment will go beyond the branding and to the issue of strategy. You know, a long time ago, we used to put out in hard copy a very big book called the U.S. Industrial Outlook, and it used to analyze very, very clearly, you know, what America's standing was in respect to a whole host of products and industry. We used to have 17 major sectors of our economy, and we have actually trade committees still in each of these 17 areas. So the issue is, how do we actually understand ourselves and our economic growth and the basis for it industrially? China understands it very well. So when they look at the pharmaceutical industry or the automotive industry, they look at that from every strategic point of view, supply, demand, inputs, outputs, whatever it is, and then they say, okay, where can we get that from? You know, where does Africa play into this? So yes, we have commercial strategies and policies, but are they strategic enough? Are we understanding where we're going economically to understand, therefore, the role that the assets that Africa has can play into that? And that's very much on a product and industry sector basis. We no longer produce these industrial outlooks. And I would say that we have more information right now that's available to us through the internet, but we have less knowledge and less understanding. If you ask us where are we going in any sector, computers, pharmaceuticals, you name it, where is there a unified approach and understanding of how we grow? What are the inputs for that? So let's take it outside the framework of how we feel about Africa. China's not worried about how they feel about Africa. They're talking about, you know, what can we get? When we look at our Prius cars, where's the input for those batteries come from? It comes from the Congo, okay? Chinese don't have any feelings about the Congo. They're saying, let me get that titanium or whatever you make those batteries out of. So we need to go back to that U.S. industrial outlook approach and understand now where we're going industrially or even in the service industries and see what plays into that. Thank you.
Yes.
Very short. One of the challenges you face as a committee is that you look at Africa, you have a budget for U.S. aid, we go up there. But there's a big difference between the humanitarian needs of Africa, which will be serious, the problems in Mali, which are serious, and economic growth, which is as much in the U.S. commercial interest as they are. So my only suggestion, which Manchester Trade has made a few times now, and so I know he's been, is differentiate. You know, just say economic growth, this is our interest. Let's see how much money we can put into it. Let's see how we can work, and we're going to get that back. The good things we do, continue doing, and no one says you shouldn't do. PEPFAR, a great success. I mean, God. But having said that, I think it's this differentiation. One of the points, for example, we always have, just mentioned it, but it's closer to your committee, MCC. MCC has an emphasis on poverty. We understand that. But also, MCC is the only institution in the United States today that focuses on infrastructure. And infrastructure are one of the 3 requirements for regional integration. One is doing away with trade barriers, 2 is infrastructure, and 3 is making the political decisions that you have to make to move in that direction. Well, why doesn't the MCC, as long as they get money, 20%, regional infrastructure could be one of their requirements, working with, of course, the compact countries. So all I'm saying is that part of it might be able to be done by differentiating the economic growth stuff with the other stuff, because America has to do the other stuff, because as Sharon says, China will not do it. Thank you.
I have more. Oh, yes, please.
I have just a really specific and small recommendation, which is, I've worked on some of the CODELs and to Africa. And so what you see and what the pictures that come back are of the game parks, of, you know, the little village. I want to see the buildings. I want to see, you know, those kinds of things. That, just your visits and showing that, it can go a long way.
I do have other questions, but I will yield to my colleagues out of deference to them, and maybe if there's time, I'll come back to those questions. Ms. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually had a couple of questions for each of you. And Mr. Landy, I wanted to know, you mentioned in your series of recommendations a committee, that this is what Congress should do, a committee that would review the conditions and sanctions. And I wanted to know if you could expand on that a little bit. What is your vision of that? How do you see that happening within Congress?
Let me begin by amplifying the comment that Sharon Freeman made. That one of the, again, History Channel, but if you remember when Ross Perot was running for president, he made a big deal about our support of export processing zones in Central America. And one of the results of that was that USAID had a prohibition against aiding export processing zones. Export processing zones in Africa create jobs for the U.S. They enable Africa to participate in supply chains and displace China. China participates in the supply chain and tries to grab the production. It tries to grab the intellectual property rights and so on. I don't want to say the obvious. All I'm just saying is that it's this need of some committee as part of this Transatlantic South Initiative, or maybe a group of committees. I can't tell you how to organize Congress itself, but should say, wait a minute, we're not the only power in the world. It's a multipolar world. We have a lot of conflicting interests. Some people worry about commercial. When the people come who are concerned about conflict diamonds, horrible situation going on in the Congo. No one's going to sit and defend you. We're just there, Mrs. Bass. But to say that this is how you correct it, by assuring that no one in the Congo can work in mining, who wants a thing, that the average American company says, I don't want to be bothered with all this mishigas concerning about investing with conflict diamonds. I have to have tests. I have to make conflict minerals. I have to make sure that they don't come from this. I'll just go to Australia. I don't have that problem. So what I would picture very much would be this two requirement. One, is there a more effective way to do it? And two, is there some way we can reduce the collateral damage on innocent parties, of which innocent parties can be Africans who want to work in the area, or could well be American investors who are trying to do a good job. So that's what I would picture. I can't tell you how to organize it congressionally, but the kind of work that you do talking to other members is a good way to get there. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Freeman, he was mentioning, Mr. Landy was mentioning export processing zones. Was that the same thing that you were talking about? And you mentioned that that used to be a part of USAID, and I was wondering if you could tell me when and why it changed.
It changed because the textile forces of the U.S. Thought that a lot of U.S. companies would go to, particularly at that time, the Caribbean countries and manufacture there, and the U.S. would lose jobs. So it was first supported by USAID in the early 80s as a way to promote economic development of those countries. But then the textile unions fought against it. So it was a prohibition against USAID funding any more of those zones. And then, as I said, subsequently, it was determined by the World Bank that the promotion of these kinds of regimes was a macroeconomic distortion. And they have reversed their position on that as well. So in fact, this...
that was their position, is not their position
It's
now?
not their position anymore. No, IFC has funded new positions to be in charge of overseeing these various projects that they're now funding. So whether it's an economic distortion or not, the reality of the world that has presented itself before these institutions is that you really need this. And so when you look at the diaspora, One of the problems of taking advantage of the home country linkages is when some of, the diaspora go back home, they're faced with a lot of difficulties of the lack of electricity, the expensive costs of using the cell phone, and so forth. So when they're able to operate in a zone that has the necessary provisions and also protections, let's face it, then they can actually do business. And that business then does involve importing goods into that export zone and then exporting into the country from the zone. So I'm a huge supporter of it. I have actually been engaged to design these around the world. I have studied at least 110 of them and have done papers on this. And I can tell you, it has changed the economic position of many countries in the world.
Okay, thank you. And we would like to follow up with you and get some of those specific examples.
Thank you.
Mr. Hansen, I appreciated your examples that you gave in the beginning. I haven't had a chance to read your written testimony. I'm not sure if you put those examples in there, but if you didn't, I would certainly like to have them. I wanted you to expand on part of it, though, because you painted an overall picture of our investment being minuscule. And so I wanted to ask you what you thought the level of investment should be. And then you also talked about embracing the idea of whole industries or private projects, and I wanted to know if you could give an example of that. You know, on the issue of branding, I mean, I do think that part of the problem is the education that we need to do with our own country. I mean, when people hear about a problem in Mali, they say, well, then I can't go on a trip to South Africa. If there's riots in Greece, we would never think of not going to Paris because there was a riot in Greece. So I think part of it is education that we are all responsible for. But if you could expand on that, I would appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bass. In my written testimony, I gave a figure. I believe, I thought that if we invested in sub-Saharan Africa at the rate we do, Taiwan, in terms of GDP alone, sub-Saharan Africa should have 2.4 billion more right now than Taiwan.
10.4 or 2.4?
I'm sorry?
What was the dollar figure? 2.4?
If U.S. investment were distributed equally on the basis of GDP, sub-Saharan Africa would have 2.4 billion more today, and it would be shifted away from mining, where it is heavily placed, and put into Taiwanese style industrialization. The point being to give the sub-Saharan Africans income with which to buy, not only their own products, but U.S. exports. We can't expect them to buy if we don't give them jobs to earn money with. And I also wrote that if we invested in sub-Saharan Africa the way we do in Taiwan in terms of population, Africa would have 761.4 billion more in U.S. investment. And frankly, that's not an unrealistic amount of money. It's for what could be done over there. And the idea being to grow Africa's internal markets, not just their export markets to the U.S., but to grow a vast African internal market, which would increase consumer demand for U.S. goods. I've found that if Africans imported U.S. goods, just the goods, at the same rate Taiwan does, they would import $988 billion worth of goods annually, which is a lot of goods. And I believe your other question was on the aid and investment model, which I had put forward. In a writing for the compendium of the working group on U.S. investment in Africa, I put in an example which is referenced in the written testimony. It has to do with the Kenyan meat industry. There have been successive USAID studies of the Kenyan meat industry, and one in the 70s gave apparently a huge amount of recommendations. And then recently USAID paid for another study which found meat deficiency in Kenya. And its recommendation, paid for by U.S. taxpayers, was fat cows, low prices, and cleanliness, which was, I guess, news to everybody everywhere. what I use that as a model or as an example for the AIM model, which is what would happen is USAID would focus on bringing U.S. investment to bear on African industries in order to reform them, expand them, and make them competitive. For example, in the Kenya meat industry case, you would have U.S., instead of sending out a team to make a study, you would have U.S. planners work with the Kenyans to identify various theaters, abattoirs, feedlots, transport, cold chain, you name it. And then each theater would have a public sector anchor. You want to build a cold chain warehouse. Okay, fine, that's the anchor. But whatever the bidding companies wish to do, if they want to add vegetable warehouses next to it, great, that's great. So what you're doing is you're seeding that theater with a public sector project, but allowing the U.S. investors to go in and build related projects, partly under U.S. government cover, which would allow then a more gestalt approach and would allow the industry to function and would bring U.S. investment in. So that would,
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then finally, Ms. Keating, I wanted to know if you would tell us a little bit more about your business. And then you talked about coordination and how it would be helpful to you, and you also talked about the hoops that you have to jump through. And I was wondering if you talked about it in general term, and I was wondering if you could describe specifically your story, and also if there's any relationship between your company and XM, or is XM a model that's much too big for it?
Computer Frontiers, what we initially started, we were a government contractor, and we helped to set up the internet in 21 countries. And from that process, we were able to be in all those countries. And so that's where I'm saying that the link between working for the U.S. government and also seeing what's available and making those relationships with ministers to, end users is kind of under the cover of being there and having some protection by the U.S. government, in essence. What I would say is that what I did was not necessarily encouraged by USAID for most companies. What happens is that if you are an aid contractor, they really don't want you entering the market because of historical trends, which were that if you're there, that we don't want to be seen as going into the market to take the market over. I think those things have been overridden, and we have to change our programming and how we are looking at the private sector in these countries. So I did have some very good managers basically at USAID at that point. They knew what I was doing. They knew I was establishing these businesses, and they allowed me, in essence, to do it. And that has turned into a 17-year business and being very productive and doing real development, which is providing real jobs. So that leads to the other point of it is that they can't buy our goods unless they're making money. So they have to be selling it to somebody. So let's create those trade relations with us. And that is really, in essence, was the basis of my company. So after those 10 years and creating that platform of both regulatory environment for telecoms as well as the internet infrastructure, we've built our companies on top of it. I have people who do internet programming, we do mobile money applications, we are on the cutting edge of those kinds of things in Africa. And I hate to tell you this, but Africa is advanced in terms of mobile money and financial systems in that regard. So that is where we operate, and it is, we're basically bringing our intellectual property into the mix. And we do need more protections for intellectual property. There are other things that we want to do that we cannot because we're afraid, basically, in all honesty, that our intellectual property will go missing or become very available and not due to our work. The other thing you were mentioning was the hoops that we've had to go through. So initially, so I've been at this now for 17 years. In the initial years, in talking to XM, physical exports. Obviously, I'm not exporting physical things. Makes it very difficult for them. The initial period when we were trying to do deals, the deal sizes were 10 million. And so there was just no way that that would be a deal size that we could do at that point. And so now those things have started to change. I'm hearing that there are different amounts, but still the reality reflecting of other small businesses of my size that try to really make inroads into these groups, it's difficult. And also understanding what they need in order for you to make the applications for their assistance. I do think things are changing now, but it's just not very apparent. Now, when I'm talking about a one-stop shop, the other issue is that there's so many trade-related agencies. It's just so hard to know where to go and as a small business, you have very limited funds to do those pursuits. So you might make one attempt a year, you pick a certain agency, you try to pursue and see where that goes, you gain the knowledge from that, but usually it has not translated into any real money or pieces out of that. So what would be helpful is to have that coordinated somehow so that we can just determine immediately, well, this is not a place where we can get assistance, or it is, and then we'll put the money towards doing that. But those are the things that you run into as a small business. There's just, as I said, you could say that there are many pieces that are available to us, but in reality, they're not. And so that's part of it. I think I covered mostly.
Mr. Marino?
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. And Dr. Freeman and the rest of you, it's an honor for me to be having this discussion with you. When I asked the ladies, my father always told me to refer to female as a lady. That's the quintessential compliment. And so, ladies, can you explain to me what are women's rights and child labor? How are women's rights and child labor considered in expanding U.S. trade with Africa?
I'll take a stab at that first. A lot of the ways in which U.S. companies enter Africa is through, we've talked about the Trade Promotion Coordinating Committee and these 20 federal government agencies. You add those together with the international organizations, including the United Nations, the World Bank, and others. And actually, there are provisions that you have to agree to about anti-trafficking, anti-sexual harassment. You actually cannot engage in procurements with these entities without agreeing to those conditions. So I would say they're very clearly set forth. In fact, in contract terms, they're called standard provisions, and they're flowed down even to subs that you might work with. So I think there's a clear foundation for the protection of those rights when you work with any of these organizations, and very few, and my colleague here may be, an exception from this. Very few firms go alone into Africa. They're usually under the umbrella of some funding organization, in which case they're signing up for all of these provisions. And of course, firms have their own set of ethics and standards and their own policies and procedures. And from a human relations point of view, if you look at the manuals of, I'm sure even my colleague's company and many other private firms, these provisions of our Title 9 follow us overseas. We cannot be exempted from it because we're working overseas. So you'll see this in our own individual handbooks as well.
Are we adequately monitoring this?
Well, I can say with regard to certain provisions like, let's take anti-trafficking in persons as an example. There's a new presidential directive for which the regulations are actually going to come out very soon, or if they're not out already. And it will be very seriously monitored beyond simply a firm declaring that they are following these precepts, they basically have to proactively have, number one, training programs, and number two, if they have any partners or subs involved in their work, they actually have to investigate, proactively investigate what they're doing to comply with these provisions. So I think the bar has been raised to a higher level to require this kind of investigation.
Thank you. Ms. Keating, what role do women play in Africa in the international business sector? African women.
I want to first add a little bit to what.
Sure,
she
go
was
ahead,
saying,
please.
Which is, our greatest export is ourselves. And our greatest export is how we do business in the United States and carrying that with us. And that is why my comments earlier on USAID not wanting 51% majority US companies, but that brings with it our requirements to adhere to all these types of rules. If you don't have that, you are basically subcontracting to people that you have no control as the US. So in terms of protection of women's rights and child labor and those kinds of things, those come with us. And that is what I would say is that the biggest thing that we really need to do is be incorporating in these countries, not seeing it as just places where we're outsourcing necessarily. So that is in somewhat the difference that I would like to draw.
And are women playing, or African women playing a vital role?
African women play a very vital role in business in Africa. And part of, and again, in some ways, the reason for doing business with women in Africa is that they are more inclined to do the development that you want to get done, which is where women are educated and are part of business and earning their own income. It goes back into the family and to the advancement of their own children, and that in itself becomes a development process. Instead of trying to develop externally into all these different kinds of projects, those are the kinds of things, and empowering them in that way is a very important force.
Okay. And gentlemen,
Yeah, go ahead.
please, go
Excuse me,
ahead.
can I just add one
Yes.
point to that? I was commissioned by the African Development Bank to do a study of the role of women entrepreneurs in Africa, and this was as a foundational work for them to create an actual lending window at the ADB for women in particular. And so we studied the most successful women to understand how were they able to be successful, and conversely, what were the barriers to women entrepreneurs in Africa. And that book was published for the African Development Bank, and we'll send you a copy.
Thank
Pardon
you.
me. Yes, thank you, Mr. Marino. I just want to make a quick comment here. On this kind of goes to the branding question Ms. Bass had as well, which is concern about African women is very well merited, and gender inequities there are quite extreme sometimes, and inclusion is a necessity. Also, child labor is a horror, and it should be suppressed. But what the concern, though, is that we see these issues, which are just, at this point, just issues, not actual problems, but we see it as an issue of whether we should engage with Africa. Shouldn't they clean their act up, and then we engage? Yeah. But what happens is, for example, in Bangladesh recently, in Dhaka, a factory collapses and they've pulled 700 bodies out of the wreckage, mostly women. Now, no one says we should never have gone to Bangladesh in the first place. We should never have made shirts there. We don't think we should pull out of Bangladesh. We don't even really call for commissions about Bangladesh. But if it were Africa, if that happened in Lagos, it would be all over the news. We should never have been there. It's immoral. We're exploiting these people, et cetera, because we see Africans as playthings, ultimately, and as unable to take care of themselves. But the Bangladeshis, they can make shirts, and they're tough, and they're part of the game. We need to see Africans as everybody else in the world, and we need to engage. It doesn't mean you accept collapsing factories. It doesn't mean you accept child labor, but it means you engage, you put them down there, and when you find a child working there, you say, get them out of there and get them into school. But you have a factory there where someone else can take that kid's job and do it properly. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Yes, thank you. I have prefaced my questions with a statement. First of all, I've been to DRC. I've been in numerous countries, Chad and South Sudan and all over the area. And I think, Mr. Hansen, for me, I'd appreciate it if when you say investments, I think we need to, in your numbers, delineate between private and government so that we know, because I think when you're talking investments, you're talking both, right? Correct? You're talking both government and private?
Thank you, Mr. Stockman. No, the investment numbers that I have come from USTR and CRS, which are presumably private investments. In another piece I've done, which is referenced here in the compendium, I added all of the aid on top, which would be about, if you calculate generously, about $30 billion on top of it, of essentially non-productive public.
I think some of the statistics show that the West is given about $1 trillion in aid. But one of the things I think that is a challenge, because we were trying to bring medicines into, in particular into DRC, Republic of Congo has changed their airport, but when I was going to DRC, the challenge for an individual that is not a government high-ranking official is the bribes and the hassle you have to go through. And we were there as humanitarians trying to help, and we were, you know, basically assaulted in terms of shakedowns. I think it's not so much a racist thing as it is much as a hassle factor. You know, Americans will go through McDonald's, they're not going to sit down for a 4-course meal, so Americans avoid, you know, hassle. And I was even asked for money from a general there as I was leaving. And I think that's part of the problem. It's not that we don't care, it's that we try to avoid those situations. Also, too, you keep saying, both Dr. Friedman and Mr. Hansen, you talk about being like China, but I know close up in front that the Chinese do not have the Foreign Corruption Act, and I don't think you would suggest that we emulate their manner of getting contracts through bribes and things like that. I mean, would you suggest that, or?
Thank you, Mr. Stockman. I would absolutely not ask to have the FCPA repealed. I think it's a net asset by far for U.S. investors, because if you say, I don't want to pay a bribe, you're arguing over the price. If you say, I'm not going to U.S. federal prison over this, that's a pretty clear no. And so that's good. I differ with certain of my colleagues in the anti-corruption field, though, in calling for a de minimis exception. Because at this point, if you go to Kampala and do a trade show, and you show these officials, well, we'd like to open a series of clinics here, and by the way, have some beer, and you know, here are some gifts for your kids, you're a federal criminal, because there is no dollar threshold on the FCPA. So, but if a U.S. congressman, no offense, but if a U.S. congressman showed up with staff, you could probably hand them a large campaign check, and that's fine. So it's...
Yeah, but we can't accept anything over $25. Yeah, we
okay,
go to jail.
I may be wrong on this, but one could have someone mail it to a PAC or what have you. We're more sophisticated in this case.
No, we can't take foreign money either.
No, not foreign money. No, the U.S. investor. I'm talking about the U.S. investor could do this, yes.
Yeah.
So the point is that a de minimis exception should be put in there. As for the larger question of corruption, I think it's actually rather overblown in Africa. It does happen very much. One thing, it's actually a function of our lack of investment there, because what people often fail to realize is that Africa, coming from a very agricultural background, is basically, you have two choices if you want real money and a middle-class lifestyle. Well, cassava farming is not going to do it. So you have to join the only real industry, which is government. And the only way and if you succeed in rising in that industry, your real income, oftentimes, unfortunately, comes from getting it from the capital flows that come in. Humanitarian aid is a capital flow. People wonder why why Africans will get mosquito nets and then go sell them. It's because that's the only capital coming in. They are a capital-deprived environment. It's like an anoxic environment. They do not have financial oxygen. What we need to do is, we should not worry about them cleaning up their act and the public sector becoming like Switzerland before we go in. What we need to do is get the legal protections. We have the savvy investors by the thousands who could go in there, make their way in, and provide alternatives for the Africans to make money. I would point out.
I think you're missing my point. My point is, I know firsthand, because I was there, the Chinese operate in a very different manner than we do, and it does constitute oftentimes, let's be upfront, large sums of money. I was there. So I'm suggesting to you that it would be helpful if we could somehow address that issue too, because we're playing on an unlevel playing field. Go ahead, Mr.
I think your question is really the nub of this conversation, and it's right on the mark, and I don't know the answer. The reason I say this is as follows. Foreign Corrupt Practice Act. They had a meeting, oh God, I wish I remember it, just the other day, and Symbiont Power, GE were there, and they both were saying, thank God we have this act. We're able to tell people no, we go to jail. People don't even ask us for bribes anymore. Negative side. People don't come to the Hill and give you the negative side because it sounds like you like corruption. Negative side. More people come into my office and say, you know, I was trying to do some business in Africa, and I had this deal, and I went to this U.S. corporate executive. I said, let's do it together. They said, oh, but FCPA. I said, what do you mean? Well, you have to understand, it's administered by the Justice Department. Justice is pretty straightforward. They want to find something, and so on. They don't look at necessarily what's going on. They say that if there is corruption, well, I'm CEO in some local, some local guy does something and so on, and falls under the act, I'm responsible. I have to exercise due diligence. Well, due diligence for a small company may not be possible. You get a whole legal group in there to prove the CEO hasn't touched any of this money. I mean, he is not even part of it. He doesn't know what's going on. You have that. You have something where the Security and Exchange, where the British have now decided that you want to cover everything that happens, even what you call the doing business bribes, just to get something out of customs quickly. Maybe your point, but on a much lower level, and so on. If you are guilty of being involved with that, the British says, well, you can't list on our stock market, which also means you can't list on the U.S. stock market. So what we are recommending in Manchester Trade, not that you get rid of FCPA, because obviously it does something, but that we sit and we see how is it administered. Can it be administered in ways that small people are scared to go into Africa, people who really want to do the honest thing and want to work on it and so on? I grew up in the Rockaways, which has recently been the news for the hurricane. But when I grew up, my neighbor was Carmen DeSapio. You may remember him. He was the last Tammany Hall boss. We got rid of Tammany Hall. It doesn't exist anymore, and so on. We didn't do it because the British came and told us to get rid of it. We did it because we reached that level of economic development where it didn't make sense. We got rid of the corruption in I'm looking at Congressman Smith, with the longshoremen. Remember, that was a horrible thing in the ports. So I think what Peter and I are trying to say is, yes, there are problems. We need some rules, but we also have to accept the fact that you make progress through economic growth. And if what we do is because we're so concerned about the current situation, we prevent U.S. investment, two things happen. One, we don't have economic growth. And who comes and builds the stuff? The Chinese. And they're going to do it worse than we're going to do. And you're going to have the factories falling down in Bangladesh, and you're going to have the roads not working right and so on. So all we're trying to say is that, at least Manchester Trade trying to say is, I would like to go through all our conditions. Have somebody take a step back and say, there's nothing wrong with the conditions. They're highly moral desires. In a multipolar world, when we have to work with the Chinese, when we have to work with other countries and so on, how do we establish something that's effective, but we don't shoot ourselves in the foot, and we don't shoot those Africans who we want to work with in the feet? And that's kind of our balancing we're trying to put on the table.
I have to agree with you. I think there needs to be a little bit of leeway, because our government, I know from our standpoint, anything we do, when Chris and I go out or whatever, we're so paranoid to act. And I know for a fact in Africa, people are paranoid to act because it's safer to do nothing than to do something. And if we can modify that law to where we're not so paranoid to act, you understand, I'm very sympathetic to what you guys are doing. But I also know on the ground what's really happening, and I think that act and the way it's implemented is hindering Americans from saying, why take a chance? I can make a buck here in the United States. Why go over there and risk the buck over there? Because I may go to jail.
let me give one last quick example, because this has been mentioned at other congressional hearings, and it's correct. Normally, when a person wants to do business, he invites a foreign person to come over to the country and look at the factory, how it operates. Normally, when that happens, you say, okay, bring your family with you. Or if you're going to come, let's spend a day in Disney World, which is only about 20 minutes away from where we're located. Under the Department of Justice interpretation is, that could be a bribe. You know, it could just be an incidental, normal bit of entertainment, and so on you may have. So I think we're in absolute agreement that I just want somebody or some group who cares about Africa, cares about values, to look at these things and say, are we doing it the best way possible? We cannot have 8 different committees deciding how we're going to operate in Africa, all setting up norms, because there's one investor, and when he looks at what the 8 different committees have done, he is discouraged. And I would say I agree 100% with your point as to that we have to figure out a way to do it that makes sense.
Dr. Freeman, I know you wanted to say something. I apologize.
Yes, I'm just going to say quickly, you asked what examples should we take from China. Certainly being corrupt is not one of them, but here's what I do want to say that is very important and is an example we should take from them. When they want to learn how to do something, okay, because they've gone from like 0 to 110% in 20 years, okay? How did they do that? Well, they learn, okay? They seriously look at every example that is the penultimate example of the thing that they're looking at. So if we're good in financing, they will call over, they will find out. They have teams of researchers who knows exactly who is the best finance person in America. And they bring over that person and they understand. They have whole committees of people who will sit that person down and they say, what can we learn from you? They are a learning institution. And so in support of the points my colleagues are making, we also need to learn better how to implement and modify as appropriate whatever, we want to achieve, from this act. So that's what I was saying earlier, too, about being strategic and looking at our industries. We have to take this example from them and say, how do we do everything smarter? So one little small example on corruption, for instance. Let's say this price of water is $1. What they have is a structure in tenths. They say, do you want quality 1 of the water? Because that's 10 cents. If you want quality 2 of the water, it's 20 cents, okay? So is it corrupt when they say that the water is $1? They negotiate downward with everybody individually on what it is that, you can agree on from a supply and a demand point of view. That's an interesting example. So we need to learn what we can learn that is good from them, just like they learn from us what is good in us. But we're not the only examples of ourselves. We can learn from Saudi Arabia. We can learn from Turkey. We have to be a learning institution.
Excuse me, Mr. Sockman. I know you want to move on, but I just would like to point out, I think if, apart from a de minimis threshold on the FCPA, where like buying a cup of coffee is not a big deal, I would recommend that FCPA not be loosened, not be watered down, because it would declare open season on U.S. investors. Because it'd say, oh, now FCPA doesn't apply, so now you got to pay me some money. So we've got the solution in place. I think removing it would be more harm than the disease. Also, I would just want to point out that U.S. investors are extremely law-abiding. On the whole, I mean, there are corrupt people, but they want to play by the rules. So that if we just provided them legal protections, that would be something. Because what we have done now, we are in a situation where, let's say we send someone to Nigeria or Kenya. We don't provide a bilateral investment treaty, so they are at the mercy of the local government. We don't provide them a double tax treaty, so they're at the mercy of the local tax authority. We send them out there with no hope of escape. It's basically a Black Hawk Down situation for investors out there. You can maybe ask the U.S. Embassy to help you if they care. But if you are out there and you get caught and some official says, okay, now you got to pay me something, and you are unprotected, unexposed, and isolated, and you make a payment, federal criminal, and they'll put you in jail. So we are telling U.S. investors, go over if you want, but don't put a foot wrong. We're not going to help you. But if you put a foot wrong, you're going to prison. Who wants to invest in that kind of environment?
I couldn't leave the country, though, until I paid passport fees that were repeatedly throughout the chain. And I'm just telling you on a first-hand basis, too, as you know, there's a mountain of copper out there. And what the Chinese have done is they'd even hire the indigenous folks. They moved the Chinese folks from China to that area. It doesn't benefit the local government or the local people to do that. I for one, would like to see more of American participation. But on the other hand, I think we need to understand the investors and the people that go over there, they got challenges too. They want to help out, but they can't always do that. So I'll yield back what time I don't have. Back to the chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rush.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been quite interested. This is my first opportunity, I believe, to not be in a hearing of the Foreign Affairs in the subcommittee, but it's my first opportunity to be in a hearing on of this particular type in nature. And I would preface my remarks by saying the biggest obstacle that I see to a robust African trade policy, U.S. African trade policy, is really is the question of the made-up mind. America, U.S. investors, and indeed this Congress has not really made up its mind about what it wants to do or needs to do in Africa. I think that once we make up our mind that is in our national interest, to me, vigorously engage in helping to develop the economy of Africa, then I think that we will be better off and will see more results, more positive results. I don't see Africa as a continent any more corrupt than I see in China, and I'm exposed to a little of that. I've been made aware of some of the corruption among government officials in China. And I know that the citizenry of the different nations in Africa, some of those citizens are very, very upset with the corrupt officials and the corrupt governments there. And I feel as though one of the things that we are lacking in this conversation, and most conversations that I am involved in, is that we don't hear from the Africans. And one of the things that I've noted and keeps being reinforced around the issue of immigration is that the African immigrants are the most educated immigrant group of all the immigrant groups in this nation. And so the diaspora, as far as I'm concerned, represents an enormous reservoir of intellectual capital, brain power that could be harnessed in a serious way in some discussions about some of the, how do we move our nation and the nations of Africa together in some kind of harmonious way that would be beneficiary to both. Mr. Hanson, I'm very interested in some of the things that you've said. And one of the, in your testimony, your written testimony, you said Africa is poor because the U.S. gives it no way to earn serious money in the way the U.S. did for Taiwan. and you use the Taiwanese model. You know, can you be more explicit in terms of the industrialization of Taiwan? And it might not be fair to look at the entire sub-Saharan region, but maybe you can take one nation and compare it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rush. Perhaps looking at the Taiwanese example, Taiwan is very much like Japan, South Korea, and the People's Republic of China in that they're known as the Asian tigers because they became export-driven economies, and we imported a great deal from them to spur their development. Now, one thing where I see a difference between sub-Saharan Africa and the Asian model is that the U.S. Does not care really about rights or what have you in these Asian markets, and just sent over much of our industrial base to Japan, to Korea, and more recently to Shanghai, Guangzhou. We did not ask whether they respect women or children or care about human rights or abortion or corruption. We didn't ask any of that. We just sent it over. And with results that in my written testimony show, especially for what is now a rather fearsome regional and now increasingly global rival, the People's Republic of China, they now have almost twice our U.S. investment that we have across the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. They're importing I believe $104 billion in U.S. products, and which is in fact, all U.S.-Africa trade now is 1/3 of our trade deficit with the People's Republic of China. The reason the PRC can do that, and the reason Taiwan can do it, is that we industrialize them, which allowed them to rise up the economic chain and to earn real money. It's like asking like a CEO of a Fortune 500 company now to buy stuff, whereas with Africa, it's like treating the 18-year-old intern and asking them to buy stuff. It's not the same scale. Where we went wrong and where AGOA is a misdirection, I mean, it should be continued, but it's a misdirection strategically, is that we applied the Asian model to sub-Saharan Africa without an Asian-style export economy. We said, okay, export stuff, but who was there to export? There was no export industry waiting to happen. And AGOA, as I point out in my written testimony, it's very unclear whether there's an intention to help U.S. investors go over to start AGOA businesses. And in fact, anecdotal evidence around town here, when you talk to people, they say, oh, U.S. businesses can't benefit from AGOA sometimes. So it's very unclear even what our purpose is with that. We basically said, okay, be South Korea. Oh, you're not South Korea? Oh, well, I mean, we did not take any step to turn them into South Korea. We just said, be South Korea. And that was foolish.
Is there any legislative remedies that you would suggest in order to correct the non-industrialization policies as it relates to Africa? Is there some specific, and how do you see an industrialization policy that emanates from the U.S. to Africa? How do you see that in terms of forms and shapes and mechanisms?
Thank you, Mr. Rush. I know Mr. Landy wants to make a point on this, so I'll be brief. In my written testimony, I suggest various wording changes to the bill to emphasize investment, which is actually to make it fully comport with the existing Section 4 of the bill calling for investment, in fact, naming investment first. As for legislative means, what has to be done is great pressure has to be put on the U.S. executive branch to conclude bilateral investment treaties and double tax treaties across the continent. Preferably they be in a simplified form or in one multilateral form for all of Africa. That would be a way to do it. What absolutely has to happen is whatever gets U.S. private capital to Africa and in the hands of private people, not through a Byzantine aid industry which basically ends up enriching folks in Arlington, Virginia. I'm talking about getting money into the hands, into the pockets of everyday Africans who are able to do their own business and make their own way and create their own economies and their own markets. That whatever gets that U.S. capital there to create businesses must be done. That will have the effect of creating not only profitable U.S. businesses that are involved in Africa, but also markets for U.S. exports. You can't sell to a market that doesn't exist. We have to build that market. So I'd like to, I'm sorry.
If I might, just before you, Mr. Landy jumps in here, I have one final question for you. I'm intrigued by by the diaspora. Those who are Africans who are here, who are quite capable, who start small businesses, those who have been trained in the best Western colleges and universities, those who have a keen mind and keen abilities and character that really, want to see be successful not only here in America, but also want to be successful in Africa, who would love to be successful in Africa. How do you see engaging those individuals, that asset, and do you, how powerful an asset is it, in your opinion? And anybody, Dr. Freeman, Mr. Landy, Ms. Keating, anybody should respond to this.
Well, Mr. Rush, I would just very quickly say that the diaspora is an amazing asset and absolutely has to be used, but Dr. Freeman is a much better authority to speak on that.
Actually, one thing I do want to say about the example of Taiwan's growth, not just our role in it, but also China and its growth, is that policies and even institutions did not cause that growth. You know what caused that growth? Money. And where did that money come from? Their diaspora. The Chinese has the biggest diaspora in the entire universe. And they poured in more money. We talked about export processing zones, for instance. Well, they put in more money in Shenzhen in one export processing zone in 1 year than all of the investment in Asia combined in that year. That means in one little zip code. Okay, so we were talking about learning, okay? The Indians and the Chinese have learned how to harness very strategically the remittances and the intellectual capital of their diaspora. So what we can do to help the African diaspora here is to learn from these examples, support these examples, and help to transport these examples and transplant them, both here among our diaspora and among the leadership there.
Let me go back to your first question, which was right on the mark, Taiwan. And why did it succeed in Africa? Two reasons. One is something they call the the East Asian growth model, where, and again, I don't want to go debating free trade and liberal trade, but the Japanese first, followed by the Koreans and the Taiwanese, built up very protective barriers, was able to first produce for the domestic market, at the same time produce for export, but keep U.S. products out. And we saw the loss of the U.S. television industry, we saw the loss of the U.S. footwear industry while these countries were operating. Good or bad, I don't think now we can use an East Asian development market model for Africa. Having said that, it's interesting to me, and there's no debate, that's what annoys me a little bit. The Africans have something they call localization, where they say we want to give some preferences for our own people to give them a chance to participate in the economy and so on. So maybe we'll have some local requirements. Well, as a free trader, teacher Johns Hopkins, that's bad. Oh, no, you have to have the free market determine it. I would rather have a discussion because everybody has protectionism. We had protectionism in 1900s, 1912, the McKinley and so on kinds of tariff bills. So all I'm saying is that there are models that Africa can't follow. Now, what can we do to help Africa? Because, again, your question focused exactly correctly. Well, what can we do to get the establishment of supply chains that operate in Africa? That's in our interest, because that's the modern form of the way you manufacture. You become part of a manufacturing process. And that's where there's a whole group of ideas. The export processing zone was one that we mentioned. Let's get rid of USAID's limitation that they can't help develop them along the way and so on. Let us begin to, I don't know how to put it. I'll be very blunt. Bangladesh has always been a problem in terms of exports to the U.S. of textiles. They have no respect for labor rights at all. That's why in these export processing zones that they have, unions aren't allowed to operate. And that's why there's all these complaints that show up about Bangladesh, the fire safety discussions we're having now. Africa basically comes out of an English tradition, at least a lot of the exporters are English, where they have a lot of respect for labor rights. In fact, sometimes people say they don't want to go to Africa because labor is too strong. Others will say it's more productive that way. But again, if we would begin to play to Africa's strengths, and I don't care if Bangladesh doesn't have a preference. They're running around town saying, Africa has a preference, we want to have a preference. Not my interest and so on. So I would say, let's figure out what Africa's strengths are. Maybe they can't be as protectionist as East Africa, but at least accept this idea. And let me just make one last quick point. And again, to go back to the really good question that Ranking Member Bass asked and so on. And that is, the way that you should apply sanctions is the way that we have applied them in the Middle East and in North Africa during the recent problem. They should be targeted. You just decide who are the bad guys and let's do it. If somebody grabs power, Assad, let's just punish his family. They can't travel, we'll bring different cases against them. And then let's try to take them collectively. It shouldn't be the U.S. alone anymore. It should be a whole group of people doing it along. And then the collateral damage should be, let's agree that we're going to do nothing, or at least do a study of the impact that's going to minimize Africa's possibility for industrialization. So if this is going to have an effect on industrialization, let's come up with a different tool. The idea of taking away from a country because a dictator is a horrible guy, but of punishing people by taking away MCC programs, by taking away USAID economic development programs, by taking away AGOA preferences, taking away trade preferences, which was the only way available for them to develop, with all due respect, coming from New York, is cockeyed. It just doesn't make sense, and that's what we do sometimes.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. Let me just ask one final question, and perhaps Ms. Bass might want to say something as well. Mr. Hansen, you earlier mentioned, in passing at least, that when it came to China and human rights and trade and the like, that and you're right, there was a lack of concern about workers' rights. There was whether it be the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, or the Obama administration. There's no linkages to most favored nation status or now PNTR with China. There should have been, and unfortunately that was squandered on May 26, 1994, when Bill Clinton shredded his own executive order that had laid out very fine and I think very important benchmarks on achievement of human rights. Significant progress was the language he used in his executive order, and then he just tore it all up, which said to the Chinese government, all these clowns think about is profits. And I love profits, but profits and human rights and trade and the non-exploitation of workers ought to go hand in hand. So I would raise a question, because again, Dr. Freeman, you said all firms entering the African market now have to compete with China. Had we stuck to our guns about reform in China, the good model that they might be projecting to the world would have at least been more favorable towards human rights and intellectual property rights and the like. So my question is, we earnestly, and thank you for your very specific recommendations on how we can improve the bill. I think, as we go to markup, that will be extraordinarily helpful. But how do we deal with the exploitation of Chinese workers? I filed with the AFL-CIO some years back, and it went nowhere, an unfair trading practice complaint, because of the exploitation of their workforce. 10 to 50 cents per hour in China. I mean, no OSHA regulations, an increasingly problem with arrearages where they're not even paying their workers. There's just one problem compounding after another, which makes it hard for the U.S. manufacturers, small, medium, or large, to compete with that kind of cost. The cost of the product is reduced substantially. As I think you kind of referenced, or at least hinted at, Ms. Keating, the intellectual property issue is very real. And we had a hearing in this committee, I chaired it, on the whole problem of China. Once a company markets its product and starts to get a foothold in a market, in comes the Chinese government and its friends in business, and they produce that same product. They rip off the intellectual property rights. And we had Luster Products here. And they talked about in Nigeria, they held up their product and they held up the Chinese fake and said, you tell the difference, because they had been ripped off. And I'm wondering how we protect against that. You know, so if you could speak to those issues, if you'd like, I would appreciate it. I do have some other questions, but because it is late, I won't get to those. But please. Ms. Keating.
In terms of the intellectual property rights, the biggest issue that we have is just that, and it's even more difficult, not even a physical product, in software and things that we're developing. So if we develop a mobile money application, it's very quick and very easy for them to duplicate it very easily. How do we defend against that? Really, that's the biggest issue that we have, which is that there are no relations between the U.S. government and the African governments in any kind of a trade practices that would allow them to enforce it or allow the U.S. government to assist them in enforcing those things, because there's nothing to enforce. So we are just in the open. We are, you know, and that's the problem with bringing any intellectual property from the United States into Africa, almost everywhere outside of South Africa. And that is a huge issue, that unless you have these things, you have the trade agreements that are going between the different countries or Africa as a whole that they sign on to, and they, in that signing, they agree to protect our intellectual property, we are not going to get there. And so that is just a major hindrance. And so we need those kinds of things in order to even go forward. And that is what America has to sell in many ways, and what our advantage is. So I'll leave it at that.
I'll just say quickly, when I was a little girl hiding under the chairs when we used to have those drills when we were afraid of the Russians. Well, if we remember what we were afraid of, that the Soviet Union might take charge, and they would what? Well, what in fact has happened is it wasn't the Soviet Union, it was China. And we weren't paying attention. We were hiding under the desk, you know, worrying about that eventuality. And so now we have arrived at this point in history and in this situation where, quite frankly, in my view, what you have asked, it is actually not solvable at this time, period.
Wow.
Very short and to the point. One, Africa is making progress on intellectual property rights. The Nigerians have one of the top intellectual property rights offices, and they've come to the States and they visited with us and so on. The Ghanaians have done a lot. There's a lot of work going on within Africa over the particular issues. It was our company that brought that famous textile example of the printed fabric, which you couldn't, they even copied the name of the company that did that and so on, et cetera. But it was an issue, you know, which is a Chinese issue. It was their product that was coming in and so on. So, and we could have done more. But Africa One is aware of this, and they are making steps. But what makes it very hard is the fact that the U.S. goes equally against all intellectual property rights violations. And that brings us up to some really tough issues where the popular side there, textbooks. I'm not in favor of anybody copying a textbook, but let me be very careful. If I have a choice between going after somebody maybe stealing my software, putting it in the government, and somebody putting out a textbook that's spreading the word I want them to spread, I'm not sure. The most sensitive of all issues is pharmaceuticals. New Jersey, a tough issue. Yeah. But how the hell do you deal with that issue? the U.S. pharmaceutical companies correctly say, I put in millions of dollars, I develop these things, and then they rip them off in Africa, cheap medicine, and the next thing I know, this cheap medicine is now coming in to my developed country markets. The Africans say, excuse me, guys, we need this stuff. We can't afford it. So again, I would always come back to the same thing. The general rule doesn't apply. Yes, we should help the Africans develop better IPR standards and so on. The U.S., well, we should use a little intelligence and maybe not go after every single intellectual property right because somebody's yelling, but focus on those which are important to us, but also on those which, quote, are deleterious to the Africans. That'll be my only little additional comment.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. For the question, a bit of historical perspective is, or just simply to say that after the revolution, the U.S. was decried by Great Britain for being a thief of intellectual property and having protected markets, and we seem to have done okay as a result. Another thing, I think a certain humility has to be applied in the face of historical trends. Yes, there are horrendous abuses of labor in China, but what will ultimately correct that is not U.S. legislation or U.S. investment trends or whatever, except to, you know, on the margins. What really is going to do it is the fact that China is developing. And now on the coast of China, wages are going through the roof. And their workers are going to become scarcer, more demanding, and of better rights. So in a way, history, unfortunately, will correct, well, it'll correct itself, but unfortunately, there's only so much that can be done. I think that in terms of Africa, we should not let concern for these inevitable tragedies prevent us from engaging with Africa, because that's the greater tragedy. If we don't do anything with Africa, they will have no economy, and they will be poor and dying in huts of malaria in the countryside. If we industrialize, if we invest, yes, there will be factory collapses. Yes, there will be corruption. Yes, there will be all that. But it will develop, and it will progress to a higher stage, inevitably, if we keep going. I would just simply point out, Upton Sinclair, you know, he wrote The Jungle about Chicago. Chicago was awful. I mean, there were just like carcasses of pigs in the river and everything. It was a nightmare. But now look at Chicago today. It's a glory. Because if you keep it going, eventually things will develop. That's the way it is. We need to engage, and we need to develop with Africa, together with Africa. Thank you.
I just want to add one point. One of the mitigating factors that we have is because we are in Africa, we're producing the software in Africa. Some of it is US, some of it is African. Because we have African people also producing that, there is the theft of it goes into, I hate to say it, the local networks, which is they aren't going to allow that to happen. They start to talk to their own people about this joint product that we've created. So again, it goes back to that joint activity with Africa. And that is the only way we can mitigate at this point. And so that works for us. And then what we would really appreciate is those trade agreements, because what happens for us is if they want to try to bring stuff into the U.S. market, which they all do, they won't be able to if they're stealing intellectual property. But anyway, that's just a mitigating factor.
Thank you, Ms. Bass.
Well, I just want to also thank you. This was a great panel. I thought it was very helpful, all of your input in the discussion today. And I would just like to ask if today we were talking about this specific piece of legislation, but you all know that AGOA is on the table as well. And perhaps you could give us in writing your recommendations, how this discussion today might be applicable to the discussion that we're having on AGOA would be very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your testimony and insights, wisdom, and very, very fine recommendations. It has been a great panel, and we deeply appreciate it. And again, I'm sorry for the votes that pushed this back about 45 minutes. The hearing is adjourned.